writing comics always the goal?
I think it really became the goal around about the time I was 15, 16. I think I wanted to do something creative. But it was around about then that you were getting that first boom in what we'll call adult comics, mature readers comics. Dark Knight, Watchmen, Alan's run on Swamp Thing, Elektra Assassin, Hard Chaykin's work, Paul Chadwick, Love and Rockets, that kind of stuff. And a friend of mine showed me an article in a British music paper that traced the arrival of all these books and stories in the UK. And I was thinking, this sounds fascinating, because I was familiar with Alan Moore from 2000 AD, but I didn't know these other guys, the Americans. And it was so fascinating to slowly track down and pick up these books. I remember the first time I found The Dark Knight. It was in a bookstore in Belfast. I found a collected edition. And, I'd never actually seen a comic like that before, a square-bound, one-shot, fully collected story. And I took it home and read it, and I was blown out of my socks. I really was. I would not have been able to tell you this at the time, but I was holding a graphic novel, where someone had thought like a novelist. And that blew me away, and I picked up the various other things I mentioned. And I think it was at that point I was starting to realize, you can do good stuff in comics. You really can. You can handle any story, any kind of material. They do not have to be for kids. This is worthwhile. I could do this. And I guess that is where my actual focus on writing comics and wanting to write comics began.
No, that's beautiful. Like I went to school for film, but ultimately came full circle back to comics for that reason. And like we were saying earlier, like it's just because like there's no budgetary restraints. Like, and once you get past the barrier of, it's for kids or whatever. It just becomes like an open field for you. So
yes, exactly.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about A Walk Through Hell. Like, so first of all, I mean, you've done horror books before. Like, of course you did Crossed, right? And then I guess you could say like Hellblazer's sort of horror fantasy. Right? But like, what was the catalyst for Crossed? I'm sorry, the catalyst for A Walk Through Hell. Like, where did that come from?
It originally began because a guy I was talking to said, this goes back to actually the time of Stitched, but a guy I was talking to said that the easiest short film to make is two guys walk into a warehouse. And I knew immediately what he meant. Like every crime drama you have ever seen starts with, or contains that at some point. But I began thinking, what would be the most appalling thing that could happen in that warehouse? Like, if you start with that very simple idea of the two guys going in there, what would be the most awful thing that could happen to them in there? Like, what dreadful horrors could be waiting for them? How can I take this incredibly simple and lazy idea and flip it so that what the audience finds waiting in there is beyond their wildest expectations? And that's where that came from.
Okay, cool. Is there a particular character that you like just love writing?
Frank Castle.
Frank Castle. Okay, awesome. That's
I mean, others. Let's see. I always liked writing Tulip in Preacher because she was sort of the voice of reason and sanity.
Right. Yeah.
I liked writing The Saint of Killers. Tommy Monaghan in Hitman. Kev Hawkins in The Authority. I liked Kev because he was just one of those born losers. I enjoyed writing Anna Karkova in The Night Witches. I enjoyed writing the lead character in Sarah. But Frank Castle and Nick Fury, in terms of characters I return to, because those others are all, I finished their stories. But in terms of characters I return to, yes, it would be those two, probably.
No, it's funny because, like, I grew up on the classic Nick Fury. But once I read your Nick Fury, like now I just I see Nick Fury in the comics whenever he does pop up now. And I'm just sort of like I don't get him anymore. Because it's not your Nick Fury. This warmongering madman.
Well, in just the same way as you can write Frank Castle more or less in the real world, which is what Max is. It's just there are no superheroes. So you can do the same thing with Nick Fury. You just have to take all the SHIELD stuff out of it and make him a secret agent, a CIA officer, a black ops soldier. And you've got an effectively real-world character that you can use to examine 50, 60 years of mismanagement and wrongdoing in the world of espionage.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Which is what makes him fascinating when you write him truthfully.
Yeah. And the fact that he is so appallingly angry and pissed off, and he has all this venom in him that has to be used up.
Yeah. Right. Right. It has to go somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And he loves war.
Yeah.
He's probably worse than Frank. If you think about it, in terms of what he's made happen over the years.
Right, yeah.
You know, I mean, that's why at the end of my war gone by, I wanted to demonstrate that he was essentially a broken man, a moral wreck of a man, because he'd been chasing combat his whole life, and it had ruined his life, ruined other people's lives. In just the same way as the interventions he had led in various overseas nations caused untold slaughter and horror there.
Yeah. So actually, since we're talking about war, I read somewhere that World War II is the thing that you've focused on.
Absolutely,
a lot. What is so fascinating about World War II for you?
When I was a kid, the war still loomed large in the popular imagination and the culture.
Yeah.
My mother and father worked in the British Civil Service, and they worked alongside British veterans of World War II. You would see people perhaps on the street, and my dad might say, "Oh, that guy over there, he was at Arnhem," or he was at El Alamein, or that guy was on a destroyer in the North Atlantic. So the veterans were still very much around, and the veterans were still around. Their stories were still very much a part of the popular culture. Right. There were the movies, there were the comic books I read. I think that, and also, of course, most of those comic books were set in World War II. Sure. There was a Vietnam story, there was a First World War story, but most of them were set in World War II. And I think it just kind of locked the war into my imagination at just the right moment, so that the battles were... The battles and the campaigns and the personalities were fairly well known to me, so that I had a particular taste for the hardware of the era. It's just the one that's stuck.
It's stuck, yeah.
I think, and also, of course, you have to acknowledge, talking about the Second World War, that it essentially gave us the world we have, and that its own events continue to reverberate. We're still, in a way, dealing with a lot of the fallout from that war, and I think that's going to continue to happen as well. So that's why it has such a grip on me, I think.
Actually, I definitely want to ask you this: what is your favorite Western, and what is your favorite war movie?
My favorite Western is also my favorite movie of all time, and that's Unforgiven.
Okay.
And my favorite war movie is probably A Bridge Too Far.
Okay.
Because A Bridge Too Far, it's the last of those 60s, 70s epics where they had the old cast of thousands idea, where they would get every movie star they could to do 5 minutes. And somehow you would just have the sense of this movie having everyone in it. So you've got Michael Caine, you've got Robert Redford, you've got Dirk Bogarde, you've got Laurence Olivier, Sean Connery. You know, there are 20 major stars in that film. Yeah. But I think A Bridge Too Far works equally well as a war movie and as an anti-war movie, because you have this epic scope, the majesty, the sheer grand scope of armies, one leaping into action from the sky, tanks rolling up a road. I mean, the scale of it is absolutely incredible, and it's all for nothing. It's all for nothing, because the operation should never even have been attempted. It was doomed to failure from the beginning, and all these men die for nothing. And that's what I mean. It's equally effective as a war movie and as an anti-war movie. After all the combat, the last scene is a little family loading their last few possessions on a handcart outside their shattered house, and then pushing it through a field of graves and discarded military debris. And the camera pulls back and we just leave them there, and that's the cost of war.
Wow, that's quite a visual.
Yes, it is. hell of a way to end the movie.
Wow.
But yeah, so that one's probably my favorite.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to look that up then. I've never seen that one before. Definitely seen Unforgiven. Unforgiven is an awesome movie.
Yeah, it's great.
You did a romantic comedy. I actually just found this out. I didn't know about this. Yeah, it's a Train Called Love.
A Train Called Love, yeah.
Like, what is, and it actually apparently has racial undertones on top of that. Like, there's some.
Oh, I suppose so,
there's some racial dynamics in the story itself. Some soft ones, but.
Well, there's also a girl jerking off a horse. That came about. I was on the panel yesterday. I mentioned how when publishers come to me and they say, "We'd love you to do something for us," what they mean is, we want the sort of preacher punisher type thing. You know, we want the sort of crazy stuff, because what I have ready to go at any given moment is a war story, and they're like, "Yeah, great."
Right. Yeah.
They want the crazier stuff. They want the stuff that, you know, has in the past taken off a bit better.
Right.
War stories to this day have a fairly limited audience. And A Train Called Love came out of that. That was just one of those ones that comes along every couple of years, one of the stranger, crazier stories. It did not, you've probably realized, reproduce the success of Preacher, but it's in that vein. It's on the sort of dafter, crazier end of my output, and it was a pleasure to do it. And it didn't make much of an impression, but I had a lot of fun, and you know, it's out there.
And it's making the rounds again. Like I've been resolicited in the previous catalog for a store. So like that's how I found it. I was like, wait a minute. So yeah, that's interesting.
Everything comes around eventually. I've noticed. Everything happens eventually.
Right. Yeah. Last question. What do you find gratifying about storytelling?
What do I find gratifying about storytelling? God, it beats working for a living. Can't imagine a better job than sitting there figuring out what happens next. It's answering those questions on a daily basis that really makes this job such a joy.